From May 1st, 1935, the German military defense was, then still called the Defense Department of the Reich War Ministry, led by Rear Admiral Wilhelm Canaris. Later, it was renamed to Department Amtsgruppe Defense, and in 1939, then Foreign Defense in the High Command of the Wehrmacht under the On One. January 1938 to Vice Admiral On One. January 1940 to Admiral promoted Canaris. But while all facets of his life have been illuminated, his activity in the First World War, beginning in 1919 as head of the intelligence department of the Guard Cavalry Rifle Division in the Eden Hotel in Berlin during the liquidation of the Spartacist Revolution and its protagonists, his further life in the Reichsmarine of the Weimar Republic, the rise and fall in the Third Reich, until his murder in April 1945 in the Constellation Camp Flossenburg, the life of his predecessor in the First World War, Lieutenant Colonel Walter Nikolai, who has been completely distorted in the spy literature of all nations, as a demonic figure enriched with all sorts of assumptions and invented stories, is still a relatively undescribed sheet. And especially in Anglo-Saxon publications, Nikolai's service is described as particularly effective in order to underline what great pikes the British were to eliminate this so effective department of the German army from 1914 to 18. But that too belongs to the realm of legends, as you always find them in the mysterious topic of intelligence service. Because in contrast to the cosmopolitan Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, who also had all technical means at his disposal, Lieutenant Colonel Nikolai had always been just a small man in his professional and personal life. And just as Erich Ludendorff was not the universal commander that the propaganda had made him out to be at the time, Walter Nikolai was never a real spy chief, but always just an averagely talented, ambitious general staff officer who had been put in this position by chance. He was born on August 1st, 1873 in Braunschweig. After attending the Stephaneum Cathedral School in Halberstadt and a cadet institute, he was stationed as a second lieutenant in the 3 in Einbeck in the Harz on March 22nd, 1893. He joined the battalion of the 2nd Kurhessian Infantry Regiment, number 82. The 2nd Battalion was stationed in Goslar until 1918, the 1st in Göttingen. There, the former parade ground of the regiment in front of the ugly town hall was called 82 in Place until it was renamed Hiroshima Place in 1992 at the instigation of the Green Party faction in the Göttingen City Council. It is not known whether there is an 82 in Place in the Japanese city as a quid pro quo. In June 1896, Nikolai then went to a 4-week course at the Hanoverian Pioneer Battalion 10. He was commanded in Minden. After his return to Göttingen, he was there until the 30th. September 1900, he was the battalion adjutant. Subsequently, he had from the October 1st, 1900 until the 21st. July 1903, he completed the War Academy in Berlin. This also included his promotion to first lieutenant on April 22, 1902. Then from April 1st, 1904 until the 30th. From June 1st, 1904 to June 30th, 1906, he was assigned to the Great General Staff, which since its establishment in 1771 was housed in the General Staff Building in the then Berlin Außenviertel in the Spreebogen, right above the Moltke Bridge. In the Prussian General Staff, Field Marshal Helmut von Moltke, known as the Elder, laid the foundation for a modern military intelligence service with the news office after the Prussian victory over Austria in the Battle of Königgrätz in 1866. Previously, such departments had only been set up for the duration of wars or campaigns, and in the meantime, they had relied solely on the findings of military attachés and so-called officer reconnaissance trips to European countries. In 1889, the news office was renamed to Department 3, which described the news work in the German army until the end of World War II. On July 1906, Lieutenant Nikolai was transferred to the 3B Department of the 1st Army Corps in Königsberg, in East Prussia, as a communications officer for 2 years. During this time, on the 11th, September 1907, he was also promoted to captain, however, without a seniority level. This was only on the 22nd, October 1910, with his transfer as company commander to the 3rd Thornian Infantry Regiment No. 71, which was located with the 1st Battalion in Sondershausen, and the staff and the 2nd and 3rd Battalion in Erfurt, retroactively to the 20th. March 1906 had been dated. After 2 years in Thuringia, Nikolai was then transferred to the Great General Staff as head of the Drabe Department on June 20th, 1912, and was promoted to major on October 1st. Looking at this officer's military career so far, it was absolutely ordinary and showed no outstanding talent. Neither his Russian nor Japanese language courses, which he had completed during his general staff training at the Berlin Friedrich Wilhelms University, named as such from 1828 to 1945, and renamed the Humboldt University by the German Democratic Republic in 1949, nor his study trip through Russia undertaken in 1905 had changed anything about this. Because such additional training and so-called study trips were a fixed part of the training of every general staff officer at that time, and nothing special. The statement found on the internet that Nikolai spoke fluent Russian, English, French, and Japanese is one of the numerous inventions. On the other hand, he was recognizable as an average major of the general staff, who came from solid but also narrow circumstances. Because in reality, Walter Nikolai had never gotten to know the world when he was appointed to the Military Espionage Department in the Great General Staff in 1912. In addition, this department had enjoyed little prestige in an army that had been trained to attack, so to speak, man against man. Accordingly, before the First World War, with its 90 uniformed or civilian employees, it had only just under 300,000 marks a year at its disposal. However, this had not allowed for the establishment of a global intelligence service, and Nikolai had never attempted this. Instead, he had limited himself to countering Russian, French, and English espionage, and had rather hesitantly ventured into enemy territory. But then it was the first. August 1914, the First World War broke out, where all participants were not without blame. But to the surprise of the naive Germans, their military opponents immediately carried out a highly successful demagogic propaganda, always below the belt, which did not shy away from any exaggeration or lie, and still has a certain effect to this day. The most horrible horror stories of mass-raped Belgian nuns, baby murders of severed children's hands, and similar lies were circulated, with which they wanted to give their own soldiers the necessary hatred, keep neutral countries from dealing with the dogs, and above all draw the Americans into the war. In contrast, the German propaganda initially did nothing more than to present the opponent as a figure of fun, which one should not take too seriously. However, against images like these, as heard, Nikolai was transferred to the 3 Department of the Great General Staff in October 12, where he was supposed to stay only for 2 years in rotation, to then take over an infantry battalion somewhere. But now at the outbreak of war, they did not want to appoint a new untrained officer to this important position, and therefore had kept him as the head of intelligence. And now that there was also an urgent need to counter the enemy's highly effective propaganda, as well as to guide the German press informatively, that is, propagandistically, and to use it as a means of state policy, they hoped to have found the right man in Nikolai. But while, for example, the Third Reich had founded its own ministry for this purpose in Mauerstrasse in Berlin, press policy in the First World War had been attached to the small espionage office of Major Nikolai. As one can read in his books published in 1920 and 1923, he was also proud of his achievements, but also reported on the extraordinary lax handling of internal security for a country at war. In fact, German espionage, as far as it went beyond mere frontline reconnaissance and exploration of the hinterland, more or less completely failed in the First World War. The personnel reinforcements between autumn 15 and summer 18 also contributed to this. The increase from 90 to 188 employees did not change anything, which was also due to the personality of Nikolai. Because the emperor's chief of espionage was an older military bourgeois, stuck in the narrow ideas of a pre-war officer. But after all, he had recruited Mrs. Margaret Gertrude Zell, who went down in history as the alleged top German spy Mata Hari. Mrs. Zell was born in 1776 in the Dutch city of Leeuwarden and had succeeded as a nude dancer under her stage name Mata Hari before and during the First World War. When interest in her performances waned, according to an unreliable source, the German consul general in The Hague, Karl Hubert Kramer, offered 20,000 francs for espionage in France, gave her 3 bottles of invisible ink, sent her to Spain, and gave her the code name H21. However, if one follows the so-called GIMP report, published in the 1970s and named after the former Major General Friedrich Gemp, the successor of Nikolai as the first head of the intelligence department of the Reichswehr until 1927. The recruitment of Mata Hari, here her French passport, which took place in late autumn 15, had proceeded differently. To this, the German Defense Chief Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, here still as a corvette captain in 1924, reported the following. One day, an older, slightly faded former nude dancer from Paris, who had been working as an agent for the German Naval Intelligence Service in Madrid, Spain, since the end of 15, had contacted him and offered herself to the German Secret Service, as the former exotic artist was in acute financial distress and wanted to cover her expensive living expenses in this roundabout way. Canaris had probably forwarded her request to Germany, after which, as Gem reported, she had Nikolai come to Cologne in May 1916. There, after a conversation, he decided to have Mata Hari trained as an agent under the direction of Major Ruppel, the head of the War News Office West in Dusseldorf. And as Ruppel later seriously told, he taught Mata Hari, quote, the basics of the agent profession on long walks on the outskirts of the city. An expert in cipher writing also practiced chemical writing with her. Her training to become a top spy lasted a whole 7 days, so a week. Then she was, again seriously, supposed to scout out the next French offensive plans from Paris, travel to militarily interesting areas of France, and transmit her findings to Major Ruppel, or maintain contact with the military attaché at the German embassy in Madrid, Major Arnold Kalla. To put it in a family-friendly way, she had immediately established very close contact with him at their first meeting. Then, according to the Gemp report, she was placed under the command of a Captain Hoffman, who gave her the code name H21. As for her meetings with numerous high-ranking European representatives from the military, politics, and society, including allegedly the German Crown Prince Wilhelm, She had at least perfectly mastered the trade with which the attractive, vivacious Dutch woman, blessed with few morals, was most familiar. Here is a part of the business cards found with her, bearing the names of the European crème de la crème. Whether Nikolai, who had given her the code name The Beautiful, also received favors from her, has remained a secret according to the media. But it would be interesting to know why he met her in Cologne, and not at his office in Berlin. One thinks of it who is there. But besides her undeniably existing charms, his top agent had proven to be a complete failure here, with the police photo after her arrest. She didn't complete any tasks. Instead, the 41-year-old had made herself suspicious several times and, despite all warnings, had gone back to Paris in January 1917, where she was soon arrested as an allegedly highly dangerous and successful double agent and sentenced to death after a 1.5-day trial in July. In the casemates of the Vincennes Castle and far from Paris, the 41-year-old was on the early morning of the 15th, October 17, executed by a 12-man firing squad. But as you can also read in the GEMP papers, Major Nikolai was increasingly annoyed that Mata Hari had not provided him with military political information, but only the usual Parisian gossip about the love life of French politicians and generals. As a result, he decided in January 17 to shut her down, as the termination of an intelligence activity is called in intelligence language. Through her former commanding officer, Major Kayla, who was based in Madrid, fake radio messages are said to have been sent to Berlin, pointing to Mata Hari. But Nikolai also knew that the code had long been cracked by the French counter-espionage. If this is true, Nikolai would have knowingly delivered Mata Hari to the French knife. In the meantime, the Dutch woman has been rehabilitated according to the research of the Frenchman Leon Scherman. Mata Hari was not a born spy. She was used for the anti-German war campaign. She was merely a woman who wanted to enjoy life and who had not understood that nothing would be the same as before with the war. And on Wikipedia, it says, by comparing contemporary documents, the members of the Leeuwarder Mata Hari working group came to the conclusion that the dancer had only been a pawn of various secret services and had to die because of her knowledge of potentially compromising details about high-ranking politicians and military officers. But in addition to Mata Hari, among Nikolai's array of agents there was another woman, Dr. Elspeth Schragmüller, also known as Elspeth, Mademoiselle Docteur, Fräulein Doctor, Fair Lady, La Baronne, or Mademoiselle Schwartz. In fact, almost nothing is known about her and her work, but there is all the more on the internet, where unfortunately the nonsense exists that one always copies from the other without checking. At least that much can be assumed as certain. Elsbeth Schragmüller was born in Schlüsselburg on the Weser in 1887 and was promoted to Dr. Rea Pol in political science in 1913. After graduating and studying at the Albert Ludwig University of Freiburg. Then, until the First World War, she was a teacher in the Association for the Promotion of the Employability of the Female Sex, named after its first president, Wilhelm Adolf Lette, the Lette Association. But from now on, it gets vague, because at the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, Schragmüller, who was visiting the Cologne Butzweilerhof air station on the 19th. September 1914 had registered as a messenger rider, aspirant, is said to have met the German Governor-General Kolmar von der Goltz, who was residing in the royal palace in occupied Brussels, and to have been employed by him in Section 7 of the Brussels Garrison Command to evaluate the confiscated letters of Belgian soldiers. After that, she came to the news office and then, quote, worked in Department Dre B of the General Staff in occupied Lille after a short training period. In 1915, she was appointed by Major Nikolai as the head of the France section of the Antwerp War News Office. At the end of the war, she was supposed to have been a first lieutenant, the only female officer in the German army, and to have worn a leather uniform made especially for her, although despite intensive research, I could not confirm her rank, etc. I have found. She herself, who remained unmarried and lived in Munich, first spoke about her activities in 1929, 11 years after the end of the war. Since then, rumors have been spreading rapidly. As you can read on English Wikipedia, she was awarded the Iron Cross First Class. German Wikipedia writes that it could not be awarded to her, as Kaiser Wilhelm II had prohibited the awarding of the Iron Cross to women on June 22, 1915. But until then, Iron Crosses in the version for ladies had indeed and verifiably been awarded to the following women in the medical and war aid service. Elfriede Scherhans, or Scherhaus, a woman named Kolig, Frieda Gessert, on the 9th. January 15. Sophie Countess of Thuringia, Jettenbach, Ruth von Gerlach-Pazo, Dr. Reimer's wife, and on the 31st. January 15, Lonnie von Fersen. Further awards of the EK2 to the nurses Ost, Caroline Biesmoor-Feher, Anna Sherman, Frieda Schlenker, the Dutch nurse von Schraven, and the Belgian Marta Mathilde Knapkert for their work in the German field hospital set up in the church of Westroos-Beke in West Flanders, Germany, West Rosenbach, where a cemetery of honor was also established. However, Mrs. Knuckert was also a British spy during her 2-year period as a nurse, the boy Laura, who has been awarded with British, French, and Belgian orders for this. She later wrote a book about it with her English husband. Allegedly, Elspeth Schragmüller, who died in Munich on February 24th at the age of 52, was also Mata Hari's commanding officer. She would then have been number 3 after Major Ruppel and Captain Hoffman. Back to Major Nikolai, he was only 27. He was promoted to lieutenant colonel on January 18, which also shows the importance that the political and military leadership of the German Empire in World War I attached to counter-espionage and propaganda. In contrast, for example, the British War Propaganda Office, German War Propaganda Office, better known as Wellington House, which was founded in August 1914, already on the 2nd. On September 2, 1914, under the strictest secrecy, they invited 25 well-known British writers who, during the war, fabricated 1,160 brochures and pamphlets with one lie after another. In France, it was from the 20th. In France, from August 1914 to October 1919, it was the Maison de la Presse. In the United States of America, it was the Committee on Public Information, established in 1917, German Committee for Public Information. Initially, they spread British propaganda, but then they produced their own, in masses, portraying the Germans as malicious monsters. And the Hollywood studios contributed silent films, like the one with the title translated into German. The Claws of Dogs, The Prussian Bastard, and The Kaiser, The Beast of Berlin. When the First World War ended in November 18 with Germany's defeat, Walter Nikolai also went into involuntary retirement, finally on the 27th, February 20, with the character of a colonel. Then this man, whom the sensational press of the whole world had elevated to the rank of a German super spy, initially lived with his wife Maria, whom he married in 1900, their 3 daughters, and his blind mother in Berlin. There he also wrote his 2 books, which, however, Wilhelm Canaris, as soon as he became the head of the German defense, had taken off the market. He wanted to prevent the topic of espionage from being discussed among the people and potentially leading weak characters down a path that, when considering the lives of most of these people, offered neither fame nor money, but only misery and death to gain. Allegedly, Nikolai advised his successor in the disguised defense department of the Reichswehr, the already mentioned Major Friedrich Kemp, in the following years. But this surely did not go beyond a few conversations, as Nikolai had become persona non grata for many officers due to certain stories. In 1926, he went to Turkey and was involved there in the establishment of the Turkish National Intelligence Service Milli İstihbarat Teşkilatı. Then Nikolai lived, now bitter that no one in Germany was interested in him anymore, as a pensioner from 1929 onwards, at Stolberger Street 58 in Nordhausen am Harz. But after 1933, he, Red Dot, had opened a new office for self-promotion at Saxon Street 26 in Berlin-Charlottenburg, with the result that, from the 19th October 1935, in the Reich Institute for the History of the New Germany, founded 2 weeks earlier, he had been employed as head of the Department of Political Leadership in the World War, where from the 1st of April 1936, he was to collect all available material from the time of the First World War and, quote, conduct systematic interviews with the leading personalities of the time. So, a pure interview and archiving position without a war-important background. But then something had happened that was to have a disastrous effect on his further fate. Because in 1941, Kurt Ries, a journalist and prolific writer who had emigrated from Würzburg to France in 1933 and lived in the United States of America from 1941 onwards, had claimed in his successful publication Total Espionage, which was published in New York, allegedly backed up by the best insider information, that Walter Nikolai was in fact the head of a massive, worldwide Nazi Secret Service network. But all of this had been pure invention by Ries to make money, but with tragic results. Because the now 72-year-old Nicholas Nikolai had assumed after the end of the Second World War that he had been without since 1918. Military use now could spend his twilight years in peace without any trouble, and therefore had also stayed in the Soviet-occupied zone. This included the infamous Soviet general Ivan Alexandrovich Serov, an officer involved in countless crimes in the Soviet Secret Service People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs from 1954 to 1958, who was also their chief. He had become aware of Walter Nikolai through Ries's book, and had seen in him the gray eminence of the secret services of the Third Reich. Subsequently, the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs officer, to whom the German Democratic Republic was on the 8th. May 59 had awarded the Patriotic Order of Merit in gold, and who, according to his file of the British Secret Service, had been proud of his abilities as a torturer, as he could break every bone in a man's body without killing him. Walter Nikolai on the 7th. September 1945, in his house in Nordhausen, destroyed by 2 British bombardments in April 1945, in which 8,800 people had lost their lives, had him arrested and deported to Moscow. There, the 72-year-old, who could not understand the reason for his arrest and imprisonment, after numerous interrogations on the 4th, May 1947, died in the hospital of Bajirka prison as a result of his imprisonment. However, his boasting in his books had also become his downfall during the interrogations, in which he had also referred to his former valuable connections in Russia, whereas in reality, his agents had only been small merchants, smugglers, and traveling salesmen. In Budilka prison, where he was incarcerated, in the 8 years after the Second World War, until Stalin's death in 1953, there were approximately 7,000 people had been shot, including 1,000 Germans, who after cremation in the then only Moscow crematorium were buried in mass graves in the cemetery of the Moscow Donskoy Monastery, as well as Nikolai's ashes. His death was officially confirmed only in 1979. The Russian version of Wikipedia has almost one-to-one adopted the tall tale of Ress, and has not corrected it to this day. Nikolai's successor Friedrich Gemp, who on the 30th, June 1927, retired in character as a major general, reactivated in the Second World War, and until his final retirement on the 31st. May 1943 was active in the Office of Defense in the Oberkommando. Der Wehrmacht was arrested on the 11th of August 1946 at the age of 73 by and People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs Command in Rostock and was imprisoned together with Nikolai. After his interrogations, he is said to have died of heart paralysis in the Budirka prison hospital, like Nikolai just under 2 weeks later on the 21st of April 1947. Thus, for the two German military intelligence chiefs, Walter Nikolai in the First World War and Friedrich Kemp in the Weimar Republic, the suspicion of Admiral Canaris was confirmed that in this mysterious trade, there is basically neither glory nor money to be won, but often only misery and death.